welcome to Addicted to Murder. This is Courtney, licensed professional counselor with more than a decade of experience.
And this is Trisha, and this womb is maybe a little more cuddlier than the womb that we come from inside our mothers.
That is very cryptic.
WOOM.
Oh.
But no, never mind. I was going to say it could also be in relation in the... Never mind. The fur of a beaver.
Oh, that's called a womb?
Yep. And I was just thinking, sometimes they call women's private areas that.
Right, her uterus could be her womb.
Right, no, but I mean the beaver.
Oh. Oh.
So I was
yes.
like, well, maybe it's like from beaver to beaver. Sorry, guys. It's been a week.
Yep, it has been.
But we're done with the week. Courtney and I had different weeks. Courtney had real intense cases at work, it sounds like.
I did, yeah, just lots of really terrible things happening to kids and teens.
Right. She told me a little bit about them, and it just sounds awful, and I'm glad that I wasn't there. I was at a child abuse conference, which, I don't know.
So much better.
Yeah, but it was in San Diego, which was lovely.
Right, yeah.
And I saw lots of awesome case studies.
Oh.
I mean, there was other ones that I stepped into as well, but the case studies where they started from the beginning, where unfortunately most time there was a child death, but the teams of investigators, prosecutors, forensic interviewers, mental health therapists, whatever, worked together to figure out what happened and then how to help the remaining family members.
Oh.
It was really cool.
Good. Well, that sounds really interesting and fits well since this week at work is the child fatality review.
Yoo-hoo.
That happens every 6 months.
Yeah, I kind of tune out for those.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not required to listen to them, but you and your role are a part of that.
Yep, I have to go to this one.
So for you guys that don't know, I think they do it all over the place.
I think so, yeah.
Certain members of forensic organizations and other things will twice a year go over the child fatalities in the region. And then from my understanding, they kind of look at how they could prevent them from happening in the future.
Right. And so these
the
are
point.
fatalities that were not due to natural causes.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like a cancer patient, they wouldn't stick on there.
Right.
But sometimes it's like a car crash or a drowning or something like that.
Right.
Not always nefarious, but accidents, but they're on there too. But then there are other ones that aren't so clear as to what happened.
So it's going to be a interesting week this week as well.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. But hey, January's over.
January's over.
It's finally February.
It's the truth.
Mm-hmm.
January was tough.
January was 17 years long.
That's what I keep seeing these memes.
Mm-hmm. It just was. I don't know why, but it was.
It was. Mm-hmm. Well, we are on the part 4 of the Sunset Killers. It's going to be our final part.
Yeah, we get to finish this up too.
Yep.
So.
Yes, wrap it up. Courtney, you want to give me a question?
Yes.
Okay.
So hopefully this is just kind of a fun one. So Trisha, what is your favorite word?
Dude, the thing that just came into my mind was discombobulate, but I don't know.
Oh.
Have you ever seen Donnie Darko?
Yes.
Do you remember when Drew Barrymore, I think it was her character that said that some linguists or whatever found out that the most pleasant sounding 2 words was cellar door. Do you remember that
I
part
do
of
remember
it?
that, yeah.
I don't really know why, but I don't know. Discombobulate came to my head. I don't know if that's my favorite word, but I'm going to go with it.
Do you use it a lot?
Occasionally.
Okay.
And I think I use it a correct way, so that's
I would assume so.
I've used words wrong.
We all do.
Many times. Or I've said them, wrong.
The English language is weird.
It's true. What about you?
I think my favorite word is superfluous.
I don't use that one on the reg.
I don't either, but I just like it.
Yeah, there's a lot of s in it.
It's true.
It's a soft sounding word.
It is a soft sounding word. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, superfluous.
Well, if anyone wants to tell us their favorite word, please, throw it in at the Instagram message.
Yeah,
Or,
comment, message,
that'd be cool.
email, all the things.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Courtney, you want to give us a little bit of recap before we finish up this case?
Yes. So last week we discussed the chaotic nature of Doug and Carol's relationship and the couple's obsession with sex and violence. Doug had started to kill on the regular and had begun inviting Carol to join him when he went to pick up and sometimes kill sex workers. He had also started to engage in sexual acts with his victims after they were dead and brought home a head to share.
So I can't remember if it was Carol or one of the other people that we'll talk about later that was with Doug when he would engage in these sex workers, but there were reasons why he would kill some, and they were dumb reasons. Like they didn't satisfy him, or he didn't like their nail polish, or whatever. So sometimes he didn't kill them.
Right.
And it sounds to be like stupid reasons why he would or would not. But well, when we ended last week, we learned that Carol had put makeup on one of the murder victims' heads that Doug had taken home. She was playing with it like a doll while Doug was participating in necrophilia with some of his victim corpses at this time. Doug was also hanging around and perpetrating a minor named Teresa, who would sometimes accompany him when he would go looking for sex workers. Teresa is 11, BT dubs, or around that age. I'm not sure if she was 10 at the beginning and then 11 later, but she was very young. Carol and Doug would invite her to join them in the bedroom. She often would think of excuses not to participate. She was a very vulnerable young person who unfortunately met this duo. And by this time, it was harder for Doug to find prostitutes willing to get into his car because they were afraid of the Sunset slayings and where they were moving to other parts of the city. Carol and Doug made phone calls to the police trying to throw them off their scent. And actually, Doug would call some of the victims' families. And he would pretend to be a police officer, but he would give like too much details to the family to, really have been a police officer. And then another call claimed to be the killer and that they were going to go after the family or friend of this victim. So he's making threatening calls. He's also pretending to be the police. It could have been Doug. Carol says it was Doug. I don't know that he ever admits it. I don't think he does. And Carol approached someone at the hospital she worked at and asked her for her pubic hair. This was a black woman because Doug wanted to plant it at the next crime scene, again, to throw off the police. The woman was obviously flummoxed, and the working relationship between her and Carol was a bit strained after that.
As one would expect.
Right, I know. That's just an awkward thing to ask somebody. Courtney, if it was Doug calling his victims and taunting them, throwing them off, what do you think his motive was?
So it's clear to me that Doug had a sadistic part to him that enjoys witnessing the pain and suffering of others. So I think that this was his main motive for calling the families of his victims. He got to relive the murder in a sense by telling them about it. And he got off on hearing the suffering of the family, knowing that he was the cause of their pain. Calling the police, however, I think was just straight up trying to avoid getting caught.
Do you remember which serial killer we covered that used to call the victims and taunt them?
I was just in jail
or prison.
I can't remember off the top of my head. Up north. Okay, one of our Canadian ones. Mm-hmm. Was that the Beast of British Columbia?
Yes, Clifford Olson.
Got it.
Monster.
Super monster.
Yeah. A little over a month after Doug and Karen had Karen and Exie. Oh, okay, sorry. A little over a month after Doug killed Karen and Exie, we talked about them last time, I believe, Carol attempted suicide. She had left a letter to Doug telling him where he could find her if he wanted to stop her from proceeding. He either did not find the letter or didn't care enough to go to the garage where she was. She had pumped herself full of insulin and Librium, and just before she felt like she was going to pass out, she drove herself to a public location where she was then transported to a hospital. At this point in the hospital, Carol decided to call Jack over and over again. He eventually came to get her, but brought along another woman to be sure Carol would keep her distance from him. It wasn't his wife, it was some other woman. Carol, still seeming to go back and forth on what was happening in her life, took 11-year-old Teresa with her to a male family counselor. Now, this was back in the early 80s, late 70s, but, per the book, Carol told the counselor with Teresa sitting on her lap that the two of them engaged in sexual behavior with her boyfriend. The counselor allegedly asked the child if it bothered her that this was happening, and Teresa said, quote, "Not really." He then said if it wasn't bothering her, then he was fine with it. Courtney, were the laws different back then? How could this be?
So this counselor was obviously terrible and did not act ethically or legally. Mandatory reporting laws for child abuse were first created in the 1960s and were codified into the U.S. federal law when the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act was passed in 1974. So a good solid at least 6 years before this. So he definitely should have reported Teresa's abuse to authorities. And maybe if he had, this whole story would have ended a little bit sooner.
This was in the book that we've been reading, and Carol probably was the one that reported this, so I'm not positive that this happened, but this is what she said happened. I don't know if they corroborated it with Teresa. So,
right.
The book also illustrates a night where Carol was angry with Doug and actually wanted to kill him with Jack. So, she keeps going back and forth with Doug because Doug's a piece of shit to her. And so then she's got Jack, and she's kind of telling Jack what they're doing. He doesn't totally believe her, but he's like, whatever. But he said he would help her, if the price was right. And that price was Teresa, the 11-year-old. Carol brought her to him, but fortunately it did not go far. This poor child. There was just so much that Doug did to her, to Teresa, that was abhorrent. I'm not going to get into it. Just know that he was very depraved, and what this also says about Carol and Jack. Anyhow, Courtney, anything you want to say about this before I move on?
So first I want to be clear that I in no way condone Carol's sexual abuse of Teresa. However, I think it is important to remember that Carol's own sexual abuse at the hands of her father started when she was around the same age as Teresa was. And sexual behavior from a young age was normalized for her, as was deferring to whatever the man in her life wanted. I will say that Carol's confession to the family counselor about the abuse does demonstrate that she likely had at least some feelings of guilt about it and was even trying to get someone to intervene and stop it.
I really think that Carol was back and forth all the time with what was happening. So what they were calling an assassination with Jack against Doug had been postponed. And Carol met up with Jack again later down the road. She had told Jack about what was going on, but then she would say she made it all up, but then, she was scared and that she needed help. Jack agreed to meet her one night. She waited for him to get done drinking at the bar. She was freaking out because she's like, I told him too much. And now she was worried about what he would do with the information, even though she said she made it up. I honestly don't really think Jack believed her. He just thought that she was making up stories for attention. And she had promised sex with him if he helped take care of Doug. And he was just going along to get sex. And while the two were in the middle of this act in the van that Jack had, he brought up her bringing around Teresa again, during this. And that really set Carol off. And she decided then and there that Jack now had to die. So not Doug anymore, Jack. And she just so happened to have a kill kit with her. And she shot Jack in the back of the head. And when he didn't immediately die, she shot him in the head again. She then stabbed him, slashing his buttocks. She then removed his head because the bullets in his head could possibly be traced. She did all this in the darkness, and she was, thinking that for once her blindness helped her because she was able to do all this just by feel. Carol left the body in the van, but took the head home after she called Doug, and he told her to bring it home. The two of them disposed the head by tossing it out of their vehicle later on. Courtney?
It sounds to me that Carol maybe had finally found her limit with these awful men, and that limit was potentially child sexual abuse. She'd been so beaten down and manipulated by Jack for such a long time. He consistently chose other women over her, And now he wanted an 11-year-old girl instead of her. It was the last straw, and I think that Carol finally snapped, resulting in her killing Jack.
It was definitely an impulsive kill.
Yes.
Per Wikipedia, another victim might have been an unidentified youth who was discovered on August 26, 1980 in Newell, California, near a pair of water towers by a maintenance worker who was inspecting a source of foul odor. The remains had been somewhat disarticulated. The family had been killed by a single 25 gauge bullet to one of the temporal bones of her skull and was found wearing only a red sweatshirt. They tried to reconstruct her face through some programs that they had back then to identify her. Bundy informed the police that Clark had stated this particular victim was a prostitute from Hollywood. She elaborated that he had shot the female in the back of the head during a sexual act while inside his car. And after her death, she was disposed and she was raped post-mortem. So she is known as Jane Doe number 18. So some of this stuff I'm kind of just taking from Wikipedia because the book just draws it out so much. And we are going to be done with this case today. Another unidentified female was allegedly killed by Clark after a sexual encounter, based on statements made by Bundy that he dumped her body in Tuna Canyon as they drove past the area in late July of 1980. She had also been shot in the left side of her forehead, and her clothing had been removed and placed around her hips. She was not described as necessarily a prostitute. When she was found, it was a partially mummified skeleton, and it was found by a passerby. Clark has denied involvement, and he provided an alibi, but the jury decided that he was indeed responsible for this later on. She is known as Jane Doe number 99. Another Jane Doe, or Carol says her name is Kathy, was a female whose remains were recovered on March 2nd, 1981 in Green Valley, California. Only the skull, mandible, a femur, along with some ribs and vertebrae were recovered. She had also been shot in the head. She was allegedly a sex worker who had been killed in late July 1980, so it took a while to find this one. Clark claimed Bundy was the shooter. So this one, he says, Carol did it. So during the trial phase for this particular murder, documents regarding this victim were misplaced and evidence was ruled irrelevant. So neither one of them were actually charged for this murder, but they think that they did this. 1, 2, or both of them. All right. Those were the murders that we know of. Carol was on leave. Oh, sorry. Do you want to say something before I go on? That was a lot of talking for me.
No, just how horrible it must feel to be the irrelevant victim and for that family to hear that. I hate that word.
Yeah, there was on the Wikipedia page, there was the composite sketch or the sketch that they tried to create from what was left of one of the victims. Mm-hmm. All right, so Carol was on leave from the hospital for a while after her suicide attempt, but when she was deemed fit to return to work, she did so. One day while there, she confided in another nurse named Leanne that she and her boyfriend had killed 2 girls and left them by a freeway. And another victim, she said, he had cut up like a surgeon. She kept going, talking about him shooting prostitutes while she was with him in the car. She even told them she had killed her old boyfriend. She told Leanne, quote, "You'll have trouble stomaching this. I cut off his head, but I made a mistake. I forgot about the shells that ejected." She then said she was leaving her job and turning herself in. What do you think, Courtney?
In a way, I believe that Carol's suicide attempt was her trying to get out of this cycle of sex and violence that her life had become. I think that maybe her conscience had started to kind of kick back in, and she felt guilt and remorse about the parts that she had played in the murders and the sexual abuse of Teresa. Not feeling strong enough to get away from Doug at this point, she viewed suicide as her only option to escape. Now, when she survived her attempt, she was left living with these strong feelings. And so she tried to get help from the therapist in a way. And when that didn't work, then she decided to tell someone that she, I assume, trusted who would do the right thing with this kind of next step.
And kind of like when you do something like she did, there's not really a going back.
No.
Like when she told the person at work and she gave explicit details. I mean, she tried kind of to do this when she was calling the cops at the very beginning. They
Right.
just didn't believe her. But this is different. So she was like, if I do this, I can't go back from it.
Exactly.
Leanne, the nurse at the hospital who she just told everything to, went to the administrator and the police were called. But Carol was able to kind of sneak out of the hospital, even though the police were there searching the building. She stopped by Doug's work and told him to take the rest of her money and to leave town, but he refused. I'm not really sure why. He probably just thought that she was,
In a mood or
yeah,
something.
hadn't really done anything. She went to the apartment and started to gather evidence of their crimes. Then she started to try to get a hold of the police again, and it took a really long time. She kept getting transferred or told to call other agencies, but eventually she got through to someone and explained the situation. The police came to her place where she presented the evidence. She told the officers, quote, "I killed Jack all by myself because he was a real asshole and deserved to die." They also brought Doug in at this point. Carol, what do you think about all of this? Courtney. Did I call you Carol?
You did.
Sorry. Courtney, what do you think about all of this? Carol is definitely a different kind of perpetrator for us. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, she is. Like, we talked about in the previous episodes, Carol was not a psychopath. She has emotions, including empathy and guilt. She knew the difference between right and wrong, and I think it finally caught up to her.
It'd be really hard to be this type of perpetrator and have guilt and remorse. And
Absolutely.
empathy. Doesn't work too well.
It doesn't. No.
Carol was being questioned by a detective, and Carol being Carol, I guess this is what she said to him. Quote, "You look incredibly like Doug, and you smile just like him. And I hate to tell you this, but I'm having, what's the way to say this? Clitoral spasms. And it's going to be a long time before I get to a man again." And then another time when she was with two officers, they were looking through a house for evidence, and she was like kind of showing them stuff. She said to both of them, quote, "Close the door. Let's have a dessert. It's the last time I'm going to be with a man. I won't tell anyone." And I guess the two cops said back at the same time, "No, Carol." So, Courtney, anyway, she could be histrionic. I may not have outlined it very well, but Carol was pretty motivated by sex. She used it as a tool, but she also seemed to enjoy it. If so, can you go over that personality disorder since it's been a while since we've seen one?
So, a person with histrionic personality disorder generally seeks attention from others, often using overt sexuality to do so. They're usually pretty extroverted and outgoing, and where the attention comes from doesn't really matter all that much as long as they get it. I don't necessarily think that this description fits Carol as you've described her, as she was kind of more shy and reserved, and kind of self-effacing. And it seems like she sought more reassurance from her partners that they wouldn't leave, as opposed to seeking attention. And that's much more indicative of the dependent personality disorder that we've talked about. What I do think was happening with the police is that Carol was experiencing a traumatic fear response, where she was fawning and trying to please them the only way that she'd ever had success in pleasing men, which was through sex.
That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't really fit with, she didn't wear the clothes and everything, but some of the stuff she would say, and I didn't put a lot of it out there because she would also say stuff like that to Jack and to Doug and stuff like that, and almost seemed like she was trying to shock them, but they just didn't take her seriously most of the time. So
Right.
Carol and the police went to visit Teresa, where she was made to go to the hospital to get an exam for all the sexual abuse she had suffered. And Teresa told the police many things. And after all was revealed to her, she cried and cried because she was thinking that maybe one of the girls she and Doug picked up together may have later been murdered. So she was feeling weird, or not weird, the survivor's guilt kind of thing.
Right,
I assume.
absolutely.
Okay, so here's a weird twist. Does the name Veronica Compton ring a bell? Well, Courtney's already read the script, so even if it didn't...
It didn't.
It
but...
did to me. I was like, when I saw that before explained, I was like, why does that name ring a bell? Anyhow, for those of you out there, it was like Kenneth Bianchi, one of the Hillside Stranglers' girlfriends that he had while in prison, She was the one that she was supposed to do like a copycat killing for Bianchi. So she even had some semen to plant at the scene. She had a victim to make it look like the real killer was still out there.
Right.
And that Bianchi was not the real killer. But her victim got away. And so Bianchi's plan failed. Anyhow, she was in the cell next to Carol for this crime that she did. And the two of them became friendly. And at the same time, Doug was in lockup with Angelo Buono, the other Hillside Strangler. And during this whole time, Ted Bundy was in locked up after his conviction in Florida. And the Green River Killer was running around doing his awful crimes. What a time.
So much going on.
I know. And I'm sure there were more that were happening at this time. It didn't come to my mind. So, Courtney, just speculation. Do you think that serial killers were seemingly so rampant at this time simply because we lacked the technology to stop them early on, like the DNA and evidence and stuff? Or do you think something more insidious was occurring in the culture?
So I think that there have always been serial killers at work throughout history, and they weren't necessarily more active in the 70s and 80s, but that was the first time that media was really able to spread stories at such a national level, especially with the spread of television news. More people were becoming aware of what was happening, and there was starting to be more of an understanding of how this type of killer was different from kind of your average killer. And so I think just we were aware of it more, and so people were talking about it more.
They were definitely being I don't want to say glamorized, but a lot of attention was being
It was
drawn to them.
sensationalized for
That's
sure.
the word. Sensationalized.
Yeah. But, as for why there were maybe so many more prolific serial killers, so with really high body counts, I agree with you that there just wasn't the technology available for law enforcement that helps, catch them faster and easier, particularly DNA evidence.
Yeah, in my capital punishment course, they're, talking about does capital punishment deter serial killings and stuff like that, and
No.
it's really hard to, because you could look at it and be like, yeah, it's coming down. Yes, it's not that, but they're just not as many because they're getting caught earlier. This is basically what
Right.
it is. It's nothing to do with the threat of capital punishment with these guys. It's
Exactly.
just that we're
'Cause
catching them earlier.
they don't care.
No, they do not care. Doug was formally charged with several murder charges and 3 charges of molestation and accessory after the fact for Jack's murder. He was not charged with the alleged mob hit he said he did. Do you remember that?
The one that I'm pretty sure he made up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the dude was dead because he saw it on the news, but he said he had done it. He wanted to represent himself. Whatever, why, that quote, the client who... Hold on. The attorney who represents himself in court has a fool for a client. Doesn't sound right.
That's right.
You might have to just cut this part. Or not, whatever. The attorney who represents himself in court has a fool for a client, as the lawyers say. So who did this? Who tried to represent themselves and failed? It was Ted Bundy. And he was electrocuted. So it didn't work out for him.
Right. And he'd actually kind of started law school.
Yeah.
So.
Doug never went to college. I mean,
He
not
did
that
not.
you can't be a savant, I suppose, in the legal system without college, but Doug's pro se motion was denied. So that's saying, you can't represent yourself. I guess it's also called pro per. They're the same. He was appointed a public defender. Doug also had started to correspond with Veronica Compton, trying to get information about Carol, since the two were, kind of like roomies at this point. And they even wrote letters where he called her his fiance, and he was trying to coordinate some sort of group wedding.
Sounds like our friend Randy Whitfield.
I know, and Diane Downs.
Yep.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Carol was being mentally evaluated to determine if she should plead not guilty by reason of insanity and if she was competent to stand trial, and she was deemed that she was good to go. She was not insane and she was competent. Any thoughts, Courtney?
There is just something about serial killers that make them want to represent themselves in court. I think it's probably the narcissistic traits and lack of understanding about how they're perceived by others. But I don't know. And Naturally, Carol being deemed sane and fit to stand trial was the right move. There was no way that she could have met criteria for legal insanity.
I think Charles Ng tried to represent himself. I don't know. There's too many we have done.
I think he did.
I don't. Yeah, he was also not successful.
Right.
The trial date for Doug was set several months in the future, and Doug was a pain in the ass. He loathed his lawyers and continued to want to represent himself. Carol had some sort of deal where she would testify for the state in Doug's trial to avoid a harsher penalty of her own trial. During several of the pretrial hearings, Doug was removed from the courtroom for his behavior. He was verbally abusive to the attorneys. So finally, 2 years after his arrest, Doug's trial began. Doug was still trying to act as his own lawyer, but was continuously denied until he wasn't. The judge did allow Doug to represent himself, but with the condition that he would revoke the allowance if he felt Doug was abusing it, like, if he was unnecessarily extending the trial. At some point, Doug, being the stubborn ass that he was, who thought he was smarter than everyone, decided to stand mute during the trial. And the judge determined that if he was going to be mute, then he could no longer act as his own counsel, and he brought back his lawyers. But the next day, he was allowed to represent himself again. Carol eventually took the stand. She had immunity, meaning anything that she revealed in Doug's trial could not be used against her in her own trial. Courtney, at some point during Carol's testimony, a lawyer brought up folie à deux. Can you explain this, and if you think this applies to this case?
Yeah, so the concept of folie à deux is that two people can have a shared delusion about something, which then drives their actions. So currently, the DSM-5 refers to this as a shared psychotic disorder. And the first recognized case of this occurred in a pair of sisters who were in, I want to say their 50s, where one developed a delusion that her neighbors were experimenting on her using new technology. And through talking to her sister about all of this, made her sister also believe in this delusion. Both of them eventually were hospitalized and treated with psychotic medication, and the delusion went away. Now, I don't believe that Carol and Doug experienced a shared psychosis. There's no evidence that either of them experienced any type of psychosis or schizotypal symptoms. I think some people wrongly assume that a person capable of violence and murder must be psychotic, but mostly they're not.
Okay, so this to apply has to involve some sort of psychosis.
Yes.
Okay. Doug's privileges were revoked again, and he was more and more belligerent in the courtroom. Several times he had to be removed from the courtroom, where he would be taken to a room next door, and he would just pound on the adjoining wall. And he had a television in there to show him what was happening in the trial, but he would just pound and pound and pound on the wall. He would be brought back into the courtroom periodically, where he would be gagged, and he was gagged with a maxi pad. I don't know why I thought that was kind of funny. Doug would kick at tables. He'd flip them over while he was shackled and gagged. When he wasn't gagged, he was yelling obscenities at the lawyers, the judge, whoever. Courtney, can you imagine being a jury member in this case? Half the time the defendant is representing himself. Half the time he's not. He's screaming. He's breaking things. He's forced to leave the courtroom. He's banging on walls. He's gagged with feminine products. What a mess.
I mean, it would be hard to take anything this man said seriously with this behavior. Although, maybe that was his intention. He may have been intentionally trying to look, quote, crazy, so the jury would maybe be lenient towards him.
Maybe that is true. I feel like he was just frustrated and thought everyone was incompetent, and he was throwing a frickin' fit.
I mean, that's also a possibility.
But maybe it was both those things.
Either way, it did not work in his favor.
I mean, he never, that I saw, tried to claim mentally ill, but who knows? So, trial's done, and 5 days after jury deliberation, Doug was found guilty of 6 counts of murder, attempted murder, and mayhem, which I had not heard the mayhem charge before. I don't know if they still have it, and a few other charges, and he was sentenced to death. Carol, who originally had a plea entered of NGRI, even though she was found that wouldn't work, withdrew that plea. And she made a deal where she pled guilty for the 2 murders, one for Jack Murray and one for one of the Jane Does. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive 25 to life terms. Jack just died recently in 2023 at the age of 75 after being on death row for 40 years. He died of natural causes. Carol, I mean, she wasn't the most healthy person to begin with. She passed away much earlier at age 61 in 2003 from heart failure. What do you think, Courtney?
I mean, there's some irony in that the person given the death penalty lived 20 years longer than the one who was not.
I didn't even think about that.
But, I mean, there's a lot we could say about the death penalty, but
I
won't
plan
get
on
into.
doing it because
Yeah.
I am doing so much research. I have a whole semester on this class, and it's a fascinating topic.
Yeah. Was there more you wanted to add?
No, he was at the time, the gas chamber was the thing. And if he had actually went to the gas chamber, I was going to go over what that entails because I've got a pretty descriptive, like medically what happens.
Oh.
And maybe we will in the future. But I don't know because they're not normally like making huge headlines. But one of the things I have to do for my class is to constantly looking about capital punishment headlines in the news. And there's a ton of them, like current stuff that's happening all over the place.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of stuff right now.
Yeah. If you just like Google capital punishment current, like all kinds of stories. And
Well,
it's
yeah,
pretty
there's that whole talk
fascinating.
about our current president wanting to restart the federal death penalty,
Yeah. Anyhow.
just to name one.
Yeah. No, I've been seeing that too. That's been talked about in my class a lot. Anyhow, do you want to say anything else before we tagline off?
You know, if only Carol had gotten some therapy when she was young,
Right.
then at least her life didn't have to be ruined.
Right. Yeah. She was an interesting person. I think out of the 2 of these, she was definitely the more interesting.
I agree.
He's pretty like
Straightforward,
Yeah.
antisocial asshole.
Yeah. And I mean, sloppy too. Like they didn't do a whole lot to cover up their crimes.
No.
He would
no.
come home or to their apartment or her apartment or whatever, just covered in blood. Her kids
Right.
saw it.
Exactly.
Like it, yeah. So it's not surprising they got caught. But I don't know, because had Carol not turned them in, who knows how long they would have went.
Right.
It's just a different time back then. Well, I'm not sure when our next case will be released. I haven't even started the book yet. Hopefully it won't be too long. But hopefully this will tide you over until then. Or re-listen to some of our old episodes that you might have forgot.
Right. We have many of them.
Over 100.
Yes.
So, you know. But Courtney, what do we do if an odd-looking couple propositions us from a car?
We go nuts, go home, and go to therapy.
Indeed we do. All right, everyone, be safe. We'll see you next Tuesday.
Bye.
Bye.